Welcome, everybody. It's April 14th, 2021, and I'm Daniel Foor, and I'm here with friend and colleague Amber McZeal, and we're glad to have you with us for the conversation today. We'll be in conversation for maybe just under an hour, and then we'll open up the space for some questions. If you have questions, it's going to be easiest for us if you type them in the chat and send them to Marie, the host of the call. Thank you, Marie, for your help in that way. And then we'll complete with the experiential practice. And so we'll keep the overall time to not more than 90 minutes. And the call, if you know others who may benefit, will be available for replay within a day. And we're also here to share a bit about the spring courses for ancestral medicine, which begin later this month, Foundations of Ritual and Animist Psychology. Let me introduce Amber just a little more in this moment, and then I'll offer a prayer just to transition into more light ritual space. So Amber is a writer, vocalist, sacred scholar, and activist who utilizes sound therapy, guided somatic imagery, and guided somatic imagery to engage the knowledge of the body within an interactive and liberatory arts practice. She weaves somatic practice with social justice and spirituality, and her approach centers imagination as foundational to movements to end depression and create more humane social relationships. She has a master's in somatic depth psychology and is currently a doctoral candidate at Pacifica Graduate Institute. So good to have you with us here, Amber, and just to be having the space to talk and to get in some lively topics.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. And folks probably know a bit about my background, but if not, I briefly am a doctor of psychology and licensed marriage and family therapist and the founder and director at Ancestral Medicine. And so I guide animist, earth honoring ritual, and I'm a teacher and practitioner in those ways. And I also happen to be an initiate in West African Orisha practice. And so when I offer a opening prayer just for the time, if a little bit of that is in Yoruba, it's just because that happens to be my background. It's in the lineage of Oluwa Falalo Adesanya Boyede from Oderemo, Ogun State, Nigeria, in Ibadan. So let's offer a prayer to acknowledge the powers. So we're not just talking about them, but we're actually welcoming them to resource not just the conversation, but those of you who have chosen to spend your time in this way. Iba Lodumare, Oba Tedede Kaye, Ba Rumila, Barag Benergunu Bikeja Lodumare, Ba Waniami Yoshoranga, Iba Ashu, Iba Awani Rumale, Awana Rishi, Iba Obatala, Iba Shushagesha, Yala de La Tujuka, Awadewa Moy Kore Yeo, Iba Bobo Rumole, Iba Bogba Agba Lagba me, Iba Wan Shogbe Keshuba, Iba Nile Boduara, Leo Gere Afakoyeri, Iba Rierina Atateniran, Iba Bogbo Agbalagba mi bogbo egun awani yanla mo babanla wani bi ragabo mi ragabo bogbo ni ani bi mombi anju mofe randa boyin ogboyin suru yin wani bi ragabo wa ragabo ipade yi ambosio do yin jawo dahun adupe ashe. Thank you to the old powers that hold up life and to the ancestors of myself and others on this call, and to the people that walk with Amber and to her Ori and wisdom. And may it be a useful, generative conversation where we're responsive to the powers and showing up for what's helpful. Thanks. Shay. So, Amber, it would be a delight from my side to hear you share a little bit about your doctoral research and the larger topic here for the conversation, cultivating resilience, relating with the earth and the ancestors, psychology, things like that. I know we share an interest in ritual and cultural healing and mental health and all that, but share with folks, if you would, what you're focused on with your research and what is alive for you about it. Where's your passion at these days?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Daniel, for the invitation. I've learned so much from you as a teacher. in the past year or so through the pandemic, and it's guided and shaped a lot of what is coming out and is emerging in my research today. Um, so I am enrolled at Pacifica Graduate Institute in their Community Liberation, Indigenous, and Ecological Depth Psychology program or specialization. And my research started as exploring the decolonial turn in maternal health care for Black women. What that means in another way is exploring how maternal health care and disparate maternal outcomes could be shifted by applying decoloniality, in applying African indigenous frameworks and spiritual practices to address what they're calling race-induced maternal stress. So it's how racism as a form of a cultural trauma constellates in the body and creates these conditions of chronic stress that then lead to preterm birth or maternal death or any of the other symptoms and ailments associated with racialized folks. What it has become is a tending of ruptures at borderlands and really recognizing how the logic of another way of being human, another way of being in the world, which is what you would consider a decolonial framework, is a disruption to the status quo of our institutions of public health, especially maternal health care that has its roots in colonization, in the colonial project. The field of gynecology really emerged through that whole project of the Victorian era in North America. So it is now moving toward creating care ecologies at sites outside of public health. The way I've been tending it is I recognized, wow, the ghosts of these institutions are not happy when you bring in another way of being in the world. And it creates a disruption, it creates friction. So embodying this archetype of freedom, we create sites outside of those dominant institutions. It's been quite a journey.
Yeah, I bet. Thank you for your service. I'm interested at least in two kinds of inquiries. The first is what you and the others who are taking to heart this potential of really embodying other ways of knowing in this terrain around welcoming people to the world and just care on all the levels that you're looking at. For the people that are actually taking it to heart and undergoing the transformative process to not just intellectually nibble at other ways of knowing, but to embody them, like what is surprising to you about that? What have you noticed is helpful for the people that um, choose to do the deep embodied unraveling of harmful conditioning? And like what helps in the cultural, I don't know, the conversion is the word, but not in a religious sense, but like there's some fundamental shift of actually being not just outside looking into a potential, but then becoming that thing in a complicated, messy, like, okay, I'm now I'm I'm operating from another center of gravity. Like, whoa,
Yeah.
what now? What have you been learning about the folks who are doing that, and what do you see?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm actually at that crossroads right now, like literally yesterday. My co-researcher, who was the director of Black Infant Health in San Francisco for many years, um, we talked yesterday about the shift in the project. We moved from creating a mindfulness process for mothers to creating a mindfulness process for people on the front lines of social justice. And she titled it The Right Within Experience. What I'm bringing to it is, the arc of understanding what happened to us is the first question you ask in trauma. What actually happened to we? What went on? Um, what is this project of dehumanization that we're having to reclaim our humanity from? And so, what we talked about yesterday is we're embodying these practices first. We're embodying this knowledge first. Um, Something I've shared with her is and was in the research from day one was centering African Indigenous spiritual technologies. Another acronym, the acronym for it is ATR, and that includes the root of Ifa in Yorubaland, West Africa, Nigeria, West Africa, and trans, how that migrated across the diaspora through the transatlantic journey as a form of embodied knowledge. And we have arcs of critical consciousness raising where we unpack, how the technology or the rituals or the cultural practices transition through that journey. Um, how we related to, uh, baptism, connecting back to the consciousness of Oshun and birthing was something that I highlighted in the work. And sitting with the imagery of that, sitting with the embodied responses to that in nature itself, and using that as the site of knowledge, the first site of knowledge, the embodied knowing of how that sort of expands how our identities have been reduced in the colonial project. Specifically, the identity of motherhood was reduced to a capitalist agenda, a capital accumulation imperative, and how these technologies or ways of being from other parts of the world and our ancestral inheritances open that up a bit. So that's one way.
Yeah, it's great. There's a lot in what you're saying. Two things I want to flag for further exploration. One is, how can psychology be a force for like aiding in the reclaiming of healthy culture, and how is it useful to think of the harmful oppressive systems as their own kinds of people or spirits? But the thing that stands out as well, when you are starting with, well, what happened? I'm thinking of Judith Herman's work of trauma and recovery, and really seminal work on trauma, not just in the context of war, but also in the context of relational violence, domestic violence, sexual abuse. And one of the things that I know that her research emphasized is the importance of a coherent narrative, and
Mhm.
what's our story. And and it leads me in back to this intense conditioning around individualism
Mhm.
and the individual. And if we just look at what happened in my personal life, we're going to miss some really important elements of what happened. And that there's a
Yeah.
need to really get the generational, intergenerational story. And not only as far back as remembered names, not only as far back as the pain that we're more or less acquainted with the recent histories, but even further back, like what happened before that, what happened before that, who am I in that context, and so yeah, um, respect for what you're bringing forward. And is there anything, Amber, from that, that you're moved to add, or anywhere you want to take the conversation from here?
Well, I mean, just what you said about the tension of hyper individualisms as a part of the psychic symptom. And that really what it brought up is my excitement for this course, my excitement for the Animist Psychology course, because um, ecology never operates from the illusion of separateness.
Mm.
And I think that was the most inspiring thing about seeing the way you've shaped and formatted this process, right? Is how we're looking to the wisdom and genius of nature to erode some of the delusions of separateness that really are underpinning a lot of our symptoms. there's a book by Johann Hari that talks about rethinking depression in Britain, in the UK, and really starting to grapple with it might be the cultural arrangement, it might be the hyper individualization that's contributing to our suffering.
Absolutely. And the course you mentioned, the Animist Psychology course, it's new for me to try to articulate the in a course format the intersections of psychology and ritual, and what you're foregrounding with an ecological frame. I see it as also a kind of antidote to what I know it's not a uniquely American illness, but being, living in the US, being a US citizen, and the depth of trauma here and the impulse structurally and personally to avoid reckoning with the difficult history is so intense that the what grows up around it feels very reminiscent of a kind of borderline patterning or wounding in the personality, or a tendency to split into black and white thinking, and the useful calling out of very binary approaches is an invitation to healing. And so what can address the developmental trauma that's baked into the culture? What's
Mm,
the antidote to a very binary, like good people, bad people, victim, victimizer way of framing everything we're seeing? And one antidote is an ecological frame. There's not a center in a forest.
mm,
There's not one, yeah, the stone might be like for itself, it's the center. And then the tree is like, oh, it's great, sounds good. I'm the center over here, and the sparrow is this moving other center. And so the one of the imperatives from animist ethics or values, which are not unique to any given culture on earth, is to be able to shift perspectives and to cultivate empathy for lots of different stances and experiences and perspectives. And so we could do worse than that when trying to interrupt the really dehumanizing hard binaries that feel like an outgrowth of all the trauma here, at least on these lands.
yeah. That brings up a question I wanted to ask you, because it's not often centered in conversations in the West about anti racism or liberation or social justice. And that is the intra European colonial project, the origins and roots of that, and how the disconnection from land was central to it. I think that's been one of the most enlightening parts of the journey at Pacifica, was the excavation that, like, Maria Gimbutas did of the goddess archetype in European mythology. But could you share a bit about your journey getting to this offering, to the Animist Psychology offering?
Oh, oh, geez. Well, yeah. I mean, I grew up in white suburban Ohio as a descendant of German and English early settler colonialist arrivals to North America by way of Pennsylvania and Ohio, and grew up in what to me feels like one of the least soulful places on earth, just like flat mall, Ohio. I love the land. I could say good things about the land, but it was tough in some ways. And so my own really ongoing journey of cultural recovery and study of history has, um, well, I guess what's exciting for me to say about it now is we're given this really dehumanizing mapping of different racial groups in the United States. It's white, black, native, Asian, Middle Eastern, maybe. And okay, and if we interrupt that, like we can say from that place, we can say Europe cooked up a lot of trauma and exported it on a lot of the rest of the world in the last 500 years in a way that's been awful. That's deeply true in many ways. There are two fundamental genocides that this nation is founded upon, and we haven't really reckoned with it. I say we, I mean systemically, and a lot of white people. And if we go beyond that level of broad generalization and try to interrupt the fiction that there are different races, then we see that in Europe, there's always been resistance from the many different cultures in Europe to empire. And even though the timeline of, for example, my own people's succumbing in many ways to empire and the breaking of my own ancestrally indigenous traditions, which happened probably about 1600 to 2000 years ago with Roman expansion, even throughout that, there's been resistance and resistance to empire in the 40,000 years of human inhabitants of Europe. And even when I say human, Homo sapiens sapiens is a suspicious kind of subspecies. The Neanderthals are also humans. There are, in all the folks in the Homo genus of like hominids, like humans, are able to make babies together. There, and so even our story about who a human is, the timeline is really more like 1.5 million years of inhabitants in Europe, and much longer in continental Africa and other parts of the world. And so there are, well, where do I want to focus here? I think it's good to working with my own ancestors of blood has helped me to get a bit more specific in my own origins and stories in a way that I can inhabit as needed whiteness as an identity, but it's ultimately a bankrupt and boring identity. And so the more specificity of my specific cultures of origin has brought some sense of belonging, even though it comes with responsibilities and debts, and just, we're born into a mess, at
Mm,
least in the United States and a lot of the world as well. But um, and it's a collective level mess that requires collective level blessings and spiritual backing in order to navigate. Can't navigate it individually because it's a mess that predated our birth.
mm. It's powerful. You know, one of the things that has been present for me in this work, you mentioned belonging, and the idea of, in at least in the psych field, we call it attachment theory or whatever, which came out of Europe in the 60s. But um, this idea of creating new terms for belonging, that the contract is not only outdated, it's it's necrophilic in nature. It is the antithesis of what it means to be human. And so, creating these sites and spaces to reimagine belonging, to reimagine connection, are a part of, you could say, indigenous frameworks for mental well being or psychic well being, that are now being pulled into the contemporary field of mental health. There's a lot of stigma around going to see a therapist, while at the same time, great suffering. I know that's something I grappled with just as a personal tension or contradiction. There is a healthy resistance to the field of psychology among Black racialized or BIPOC people, if we want to use that terminology, and rightly so. I know on my first day, what kept me in this journey, the teacher at the end of the intro class said, "The field of psychology is dead, and it's dead because it was mostly imagined by Victorian era white men or European men, and they couldn't possibly know everything about what it means to be human or to be well, or know everything about the interior psychic landscape." So excavating, it feels like, for me, a Sankofa movement, a reaching back, so to speak, to these indigenous ways of being human, and allowing that to inform how we are reshaping this field to make it more welcoming to the rest of us. And not, I think, let's put this on the table too, not perpetuating the same patterns and paradigms of harm that are the root of the suffering in the first place.
Yeah. We have a 3-year-old. She's lovely. And she said something. I hadn't intended to bring this up, but as opening to a thing. But she said something 2 months ago. Me and Sarah were like, "Are you serious?" Our teacher, our Oluwo in Nigeria, was making prayers or something, and we were just chatting him, and she's like, "Oluwo's skin is black. My skin is white. I don't like his skin." And I'm just like, "Where did you like?" Response, because we're really like trying to like do the right thing, and I'm like, and so we had a moment with it, and she also is like, "I don't love you because you're not a girl." And she said, I mean, so there's like, I don't feel like terribly worried about it. And there's a thing about how to be, we're educating her about melanin and trying to like be proactive and all that. And it has me reflecting more acutely, like at home, like what are the roots of supremacy? Like, sure, it gets baked into systems, and we can talk about racial supremacy, white supremacy. We can talk about patriarchy, misogyny, and gender, or nationalism, or human supremacy that devalues the other than humans. Or so basically, my group or whatever group is better than another group.
Mm,
So this impulse to typically say my pattern, my body shape, my skin color, my identity is better than your identity.
mhm,
And I've just come to see so many of the cultural troubles that then create psychological trauma that then reinforce the harmful systems as understandable through this lens of supremacy, of seeing one way as being superior to another way. If we come back to the ecological model, the oak is not like, oaks are just objectively better than rhododendron. Like, you're a bad tree over there. It's just not really what's happening in the forest in the same way. And so what do we do? Like, how do we, in an embodied way, not just like some intellectual exercise, like get at the things within us that um, enable that thinking and affirm something else in its place? Like, what's the affirmation? It's something I worry about. Not like it keeps me up, but like even the framing of like anti-racist, like I get it, I'm not presuming to walk into that and have some critique of it, but what's the affirmative? Like ritually speaking, if you want a sunny day, you're not like anti-rain, you say
mm,
sun. So what are we affirming? Is it an affirmation of the like beauty of ancestral difference? Is it
mm,
like the ethic of affirming like the beauty of difference and diversity of form? Like, how
mhm,
do we talk about what we are trying to call into being?
mhm.
And yeah.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. Maybe this is how the ancestors are moving. A part of my experience at Pacifica in the somatics program involved a rupture around the skin. It was just a rupture that needed to be tended. It also became the site of growth. So I've been sitting with that for a long time, and in that embodied way of, okay, now what do I do with all this rubble and ash that has just flown into my lap? Because this is the state we're in. This is where we are. As long as we are still checking the boxes of race as identity markers, and we live in this racialized society, we are inheriting all of the psychic gravity of that delusion as well. Um, but one of the things that it brought to mind for me, something that emerged, I also had this tension too, and angst of like anti-racist is not enough. And it really came out in my scholarship, in my research. I didn't want to just stop there. because, like you said, we have to replace it with something else, something generative. Resma Menakem, in his book, My Grandmother's Hands Healing from Racialized Trauma, he talks about that. He says, we're not going to get rid of white body supremacy delusions by tearing it to pieces and sort of going into attack mode and just ripping the enemy or the other to shreds. What we actually have to do is create um, new uh, sort of markers of belonging, new cultures, um, because white supremacy delusion has a culture that offers the opportunity to belong to something. It does. And we don't yet have an embodied culture, that's what his work asserts, within whiteness to sustain the visions of liberation that we hold and we seek and that we're pursuing. We don't yet have it in our bodies. He's mainly talking about white racialized folk. So, one of the things that I've been writing on is this idea of biophilia. And so it's my answer to anti-racism. Okay, yes, anti-racist, but what am I pro? Biophilia is a term that basically describes the innate human impulse toward life, that we have a drive to eat, to grow, to connect. It's foundational in somatic psychologies is the idea that we're hardwired to be in relationship. It's a part of how we sustain our mental health, our psychic health. So I've been pushing forward with this idea of biophilic politics as a terrain, as an approach to become the generative voice of anti-racism. That what I'm pursuing are ways and spaces that are my policies, the social agreement, and the social imaginary can reflect a preservation and exaltation of life, as opposed to what we've inherited with this colonial modernity paradigm, which is the opposite. It is, yeah.
Let's talk about ritual and about grief and about I feel like the intellectual framing of this stuff can be really useful to create a sense of safety to actually engage in the experiential transformative whatever needs to happen to embody something different. And then from that, after you're curled up crying for a while, or you're confused, or there's some reorganization, your life falls apart, then maybe you dust off and you're like, oh, I'm going to think some new thoughts now. And then there's a little intellectual refinement a little bit. And then that gets you safely along with like world at arm's length a little bit. And then there's like a falling apart again, or another layer of melting, or whatever it might be. But maybe you could weave us in a little about what your experience or your observations have been about approaching the trouble that we've inherited, and then actually and being like there's a willingness. Okay, I meet a lot of people who are like, great, conceptually I'm in, like, sign me up for the transformative whatever, I want the better thing, what do I do? And it's like, well, yeah, it's a good question. What do you do? Like, what is, like, there's a lot of things to do or stop doing, as it were, and a lot of feels that might occur. And then suddenly the idea that the other than humans are people, very nice abstraction. And then you start to see how we are with life. It's like, oh my God, what are we doing? Now it's suddenly there's a whole backlog of harms that are being enacted, and pain that is being skimmed over, and relationships that are being harmed. And I feel sometimes like it can be a disincentive to become more conscious.
Mm,
It's kind of like, if I take on that view, that's going to involve crying my face off. And I don't know if I can really do that, because if I start, I don't know if I'm going to be able to stop. And so let's find our way into that focus a little. Yeah.
Yeah. She's taken me, grief. I'll refer to her as she today. She's taken me down such a deep river. But I'm gonna start with the seeds of learning about grief, which for me is New Orleans, one of the most Africanized cities in the United States. And I also want to, before I launch into that, just presence and name. Um, yeah, we're in a state of grieving right now. I know if you're looking at anything happening in the world, with the Chauvin case, among other things, it feels like an onslaught, like never-ending waves, the incessant waves of this hit of having to grapple with our loss, having to grapple with our loss. And the colonial project has involved a lot of loss, a lot. Um, and we're not yet out of it. We're still in it. I often like to say, can somebody tell me America's decolonization date? We don't have one. Like we're still here. We're still we're not Senegal. We're not South Africa. We don't have a date. Beyond even the perpetuation of the logic of colonialism after the administrations have left. But so starting with my the seeds for me, I learned through observing through the second line tradition, which I later came to find out was brought over, was a ritual practice carried over through the diaspora, probably through Haiti, Benin, Haiti, landing in Louisiana, or an amalgamation thereof. And it taught me a few things. One, the connection between grieving in community and how it is the gateway to joy. So I'll just share the story real briefly of what this is. The second line tradition is named after, it's a funeral procession that happened in the city of New Orleans, where the first line is comprised of the casket and the family. And this is modeled after, in the old days, carrying the casket by horse to the grave. And the second line begins after the band, the brass band. And everyone will then fall in line after the brass band, creating the second line. And so as the procession moves and snakes through the city, toward the graveyard, you play the dirge, or the songs of sadness and lament and sorrow. And then you perform the rites, uh, place the body in the cemetery, and then you play songs of jubilant and jubilee all the way to that person's favorite place to eat, or to some other hall where you break bread, you tell stories, and you remember. And the thing that stuck out, of course, after I left New Orleans, which was post Katrina, it's always in hindsight, you get some distance and you look back and go, wow, is that what we were doing? And the lessons that are most pronounced is that some wounds are not meant to be held alone, that they are meant to be held together. Um, Secondly, the idea of interconnection, like quantum theory was in effect, in action, in a very lived and embodied way, that it didn't matter if you knew the person who had transitioned. The idea was that someone did. So you can come out of the house hearing the band and just tip your hat or join in the line, because someone in our collective family has made a great movement, a great change has happened. So the idea of that collective process, going back to what you said about the ritual arts, um, so important to be in relationship and in community to grapple with some of these big wounds. And having been introduced to your work, taking that process last year with the ancestral medicine healing journey, one of my favorite lines from you was, big systemic wounds sometimes require bigger medicine or big medicine, and that our elder ancestors can be of support in bringing in that bigger medicine. Further, the earth itself is our elder ancestor. The water itself is our elder ancestor. We are interdependent with these beings. But the colonial paradigm and logic has insisted on denying that it is alive or that we're connected to it at all for the purpose of domination.
Yeah. I went to really sort of progressive out there schools with for my psychology training, transpersonal humanistic psychology. And I don't think anyone really ever at any point, even in those schools or in my clinical training, ever suggested that I should be calling on the support of the ancestors, the earth, the deities, the elements, the elder powers that shape life when I'm working as a clinician.
Wow.
And I'm like, really? Like, how are you supposed to get this done? Because the client's showing up saying, I'm under the weight of intergenerational and systemic and interpersonal sorrow and pain that's manifesting in my personal life. And if the response is, okay, well, let's talk about it. Okay, that is maybe useful to a degree, but as you're saying, I do see it that way, that it's part of training as a healer is to know how to call upon the bigger forces to bring good medicine. And to do that is to interrupt our trauma induced, highly self reliant, extreme individualism that's so much a product of the culture.
Mm,
And that's tough for a lot of people. It's vulnerable. There's a feeling you might get dropped again, and you might,
mm,
but if you don't risk it, you're definitely stuck. And if we don't find a way to risk that, the isolation, the lack of belonging, and all the psychic illness and vulnerability that, in a not good way, that follows from that is going to set in. And I was just 4 times to Nigeria for ritual training and work, and it's been good and challenging, but good each time. And but one of the things that is was very clear each time is that the idea, like, sure, there might be some rituals you can do by yourself, but when people think about doing ritual or communion with the deities, it's group ritual process. You
mhm,
don't typically divine for yourself if it's an involved thing. You don't do the offerings necessarily for yourself. Things happen in community.
mhm,
And when we talk about resilience as a theme, when adversity comes at us, as it inevitably will, the challenge is to spread out the impact to the group nervous system,
mhm,
whether it's the second line as you're describing, or the group holding the larger process of ancestralizing the dead, or of like metabolizing the trauma of a thing. It's part of the cost of belonging. You want to be part of a group? Great. You have this percentage of the collective trauma that you're now responsible to metabolize. Like, we
mhm,
share it. Like, we share the profits. We also share the collective trauma, and that's part of group belonging. And so, who are the others we lean on? This is, I have a lot of love for the field of psychology and mental health. I do. I like, in most contexts, I'll kind of defend it from people who are dismissive of therapy. I'm like, you ought to try it. You
mm,
might be more fun to be around. And but also, the things psychology does, it makes me crazy. Like, a lot of the time, not all the time, not everybody, is unconsciously perpetuate the idea that humans are alone in the world, and so psychology, as it like Western Eurocentric psychology, which is gradually, usefully, necessarily diversifying and reckoning with the rest of the other psychologies of different traditions which predate it. That
Mm,
psychology, that more specific one, tends to be the psychology of living humans and their relationship with other living humans,
mm-hmm.
which is really important and really deeply incomplete insofar as culture is also of the earth. Culture, the psyche, is not just human.
Right.
And there's all these others whose voices are silenced. If you want to be activist jargony, it's erasure. We're committing erasure of the other than human people whose communities of kinship and relatedness predate our arrival to a place often enough.
Mm,
And so how do we weave their voices in? And once we're in relationship with them, what happens is they also can help us to absorb the shock of the trauma
mm,
that's happening. And they're like, great, we'll help with that. And all, by the way, you're causing mass extinction. So if you could help absorb the shock of our trauma, that'd be great. Let's keep it reciprocal. And so the price of belonging as an earth person in that way, the biophilia leads to bio sorrow.
mm,
Um,
mm-hmm.
but that's belonging. They're like, welcome. Like you said, the joy is the togetherness that follows from it. But
Yeah.
there's no way to not be just wrecked by the waves of sorrow with the catastrophe you are enacting.
And in that same colonial paradigm, um, we place, like, if we're creating a center pole, there's always the creation of a margin, right? It's by design. And big feelings, much like the earth and nature, are at that margin too. There's a strategy behind that. There's a strategy in sort of making it distasteful or shameful or whatever to embody or embark upon those big emotions that um, needs to be addressed too. And that actually, it brings up this question for me. You've got your experience in the field, with psychology and working with clients, having centers in that way. So, going back to this idea of the ghosts of our institutions, the ghosts of the institution of psychology, what are some of the major barriers to incorporating an animist perspective or a more expansive perspective, from trainings of therapists to licensure protocol or criterion to billing procedures and the DSM and things like that? What do you think? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks, Amber, for the question. I work with what to say. I end up working with a fair amount of therapists, and what I observe, I don't know how true it is, but what I observe is people feel afraid that if they go into the terrain of explicitly acknowledging even just the functional reality, let's set aside, is it like ontologically real? Do we need to have a belief structure around it? Just the practical reality of the ancestors or of the earth or of things like that. They're worried they'll get in trouble with their license. Like, is this legit? Is it okay to do this? And maybe that's true. I mean, there's a thing to tease out there, but what I wonder is like, has the fear of breaking the cultural taboo that like psychology as a field really wants to belong and really wants to be in the cool accepted club, which means that as a so-called soft science, it reaches for the level of legitimacy of like chemistry or physics or sciences that even more strongly study the physically observable world. Whereas physics is like, we're so strange. If you actually knew what was going on over here, like the belonging is really tripped out. But anyways, with the psychology, that impulse to belong is really a way of reinforcing the unconscious racist colonialist power structure by saying only the physically observable world is real. And if you view things otherwise, that's superstitious, uneducated, browner people behavior. I mean, that's
Mm.
really the European arrogance, like at its undistilled form. And it will cost you your belonging. It'll cost you your job. It'll cost you your license. You'll have the
Yeah.
student debt, but not the license anymore. So if you overstep that line, you're threatened with an inability to provide for yourself.
Mm.
So those dynamics are very much still alive. The APA, American Psychological Association, is fine with someone who's a Native American client being referred to a traditional healer. But what if the traditional healer is also a clinical psychologist?
Mm.
Or what if the client is not a card carrying enrolled tribal member?
Mm-hmm.
What if they're like a whitey McWhite guy like myself who just believes in talking to dead people? Like, is it all right to be referred to a healer of whatever background? And so there's a psychology is comfortable, and I'm generalizing about the field, but the norms are comfortable generalizing or fetishizing Native peoples or even African peoples. Oh, that's a traditional African thing, or that's a Native thing. But as soon as we get to European ancestral people talking to the dead, or the clinicians talking about talking to the dead at a clinical conference,
Mm-hmm.
that oversteps because it comes from a different epistemological framework that legitimizes contact with the ancestors, with the land, with the other than humans, and it interrupts human supremacy, frankly.
Mm. Mm.
Beneath the white supremacy that is, Euro culture supremacy is a human supremacy attitude. And,
Yeah.
and once you interrupt that, you're it's a betrayal. It's a betrayal of the unspoken agreement to be on the like top of the food chain or whatever. And the system doesn't always like it. So there's this, and that imprinting of the system within the people who train in psychology shows up as like, if I do that, will I lose my license?
Yeah.
Which is not that different than, if I still try to worship the old gods, will I be able to provide for my children, or will they be taken from me? And will we 1,000 years later enact that on other people?
Mm-hmm. Mm. It's a stronghold on the root chakra, and our survival. I think that's what's been become so apparent for me. This idea I've been pushing forth for years, decolonizing the psyche, or that interiority is how these things, these ideologies and values. It's a value system that constellates in my flesh and in my behaviors, that maps and shapes my nervous system and the meaning making that happens. That becomes an impulse or a reticence to, offer something or withhold it, right? Um, and what's interesting though about that, you saying that there's been a big critique, especially in this field of somatics, at least, is a, well, not a desire. It's students who are studying this field always looking to the wisdom of other indigenous cultures. If it's what's it called, the I Ching in China, or Taoist practices, Native American practices, spiritual modalities, or whatever, African indigenous practices, that they're constantly pulling on or appropriating, was the critique that came forward in that particular conversation, and wanting to weave these into their training. So there's a yearning to open up the field a bit more, and make this more valid, make this a valid approach to tending the body, mind, and spirit, as opposed to a fringe or eccentric alternative approach. And then weaving that into the trainings, the institutional development, the CEUs, the licensure, the insurance billing processes to say, okay, no, we're going to make a pathway for this. We're going to imagine or co-imagine how this would actually uh, take place, come about.
Yeah, that's good. I see there are a few questions coming in. I'll flag that also for you, Amber, if there are any that speak to you to respond to. And what you're speaking of, it's you know, as someone of European ancestry is raised in American cultural bankruptcy, who's now finding gradually a sense of belonging and also happens to be involved in West African practice, even though I'm so clearly not ethnically Yoruba, it's fruitful and also complicated to participate in traditions not of your own ancestries. And one of the things I see, especially white people in the US at times doing in the idealization of indigeneity, is there's a way in which it's letting people off the hook. It lets you off the hook to do that. If you say this is like the traditionalists or the spiritual people, I'm the inherently harmful because I'm white person, I
Hmm.
can never aspire to that, and therefore I don't really have to. Like, I don't have to really embody that because it's not really my heritage to embody that. I just need to be a good ally to conscious people rather than
Hmm.
talk to the dead myself.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of indigenous folks are like, well, what, I mean, like, what, you're doing a lot of talking. Why don't you come crawl into this lodge and put your face in the dirt until you forget your name because it's gonna be really hot or whatever. And so there's a sense of just get down to business. And I don't mean to be, I don't mean that from like an arrogant, dismissive way. There's a lot of like sacredness to the intellectual inquiry, but I worry at times about the appropriate corrective respect for people of African ancestries or indigenous ancestries or whatever it might be, crossing this line into idealization and fetishizing
Mm.
in a way that lets people off the hook from investigating the own, like the messy rubble of one's own cultural origins.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got to bring in France Fanon here because he's really, the first decolonial psychiatrist, and his idea of sociogeny. Like, what if we put the symptom of white racialization, what if we put those traumatic symptoms in a context, right? Like, there's a reason, there's a huge reason why one who is racialized as white may need to go and sit at the foot of these other elders and these other cultural practices in order to reclaim what's at the heart of that racial trauma, becoming white. At the heart of it was that disconnection from land. At the heart of it was the genocide of women, right, on the continent. At the heart of it is the enclosure movement and the formation of capital accumulation and all that good stuff, right? Like all of that and the hyper individualization that goes along with it. So I think there's a way to move beyond the binary, like transcending into uh, the third thing, if you will, um, the perfect victim victimizer binaries to understand a more comprehensive story of why we're doing this in the first place as a white racialized person.
There's a moment that stands out in my awareness, and then we'll go to a few of the questions uh, from what you shared, Amber. I'm picturing a moment. I think it's the third trip in recent years to Nigeria, and we're sitting in the morning before sunrise, and the guys are in the room doing some of the other awos or Ifa initiates and doing ritual work with Odu, which is a transformatively powerful aspect of the sacred feminine in Yoruba cosmology. And I'm just sitting on this bench, this like hard wooden bench next to some other person. I didn't know that particular person. And for one, I'm like, this is a nice way to spend a morning, like up before sunrise with the guys, giving some reverence to the sacred mothers that hold together life. And then also, it's hard to capture it exactly, but there's a feeling of being able to see, because it was getting externalized, this judgment that had been socialized into me. And
Mm.
it wasn't primarily, at least in that moment, around race so much as class. And these folks being like very work, like those particular people happen to be very working class, like probably agriculturalists or farming their local plot of land or whatever they're doing. And some part of me had been conditioned to see myself as like it's never so explicit as like better than them, but
Mm.
like there's a some like an attitude that I was bringing in that created the separation. They were
Mm.
not creating that with me. And I just started crying. I'm just like, God, like what a mind fuck of all this like separation that in that case I had been encouraged to carry with me,
Mhm.
and just needing to grieve out another layer there in order to become a regular sized body on the bench next to the other men, like giving reverence to the mothers that hold up life.
Sure.
And I'm like, it's just like the shedding and shedding and shedding of harmful conditioning to just become a regular person, to do a
Mm.
really normal thing like wake up before sunrise and make offerings to the ancient mothers. And yeah, so the somatic unlearning, or the shedding, I guess, is what I'd say there. And also how, not to go way into it, but how it's really important to not lose sight of how much class and access to resources drive a lot of the other kinds of separations that we're trying to unravel. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Um, is there a question that stands out for you? I see one that I might speak to, but I can, if unless you prefer to, Amber. Yeah.
Um, I actually need to take a look now. I
Great.
hadn't.
I'll dive in, and then if you want to
Yeah.
as well, it's great. Somebody asks, is there any advice for youth and young adults who are experiencing a so-called identity crisis and would like to reconnect with their pre-colonial ancestors who they don't know? Yeah, it's actually something I'm intending to talk about publicly more soon, about parenting from a animist ritualist perspective. But one of the most fundamental things is to do that yourself. You need to, like, as a caregiver or an auntie or uncle or ally to younger people, the first most important thing is to live it, and to have your own pre-colonialist ancestors in your larger field, and to be able to sit with that person and see them in the moment and love them with the direct felt backing of your ancestors there, and ask your ancestors to bring some kind of breakthrough or healing intervention for that young person. And so there's the obvious levels where it's important to embody it, and then there's like the subtle, you could say spiritual unseen levels, where having your ancestors present in the field will make it easier for that person's ancestors to step forward. And then there's also breaking the cultural taboos to be able to talk about those things. I didn't have anybody talk to me about any of that kind of stuff until I was like, 19 or 20, which is still early, and it was helpful. But had someone as a teenager been like, the dead people aren't really dead, and you can talk to spirits, and humans are just one kind of person, and oh my God, we're totally surrounded by all these weird things that nobody never talks about. You want to get to know them? Be like, yeah, that sounds way better than what's going on. How? And so create break the taboo on naming those things from an embodied place, and name the mess we're in culturally, if you can, and how confusing it is. I think a lot of younger people respond well to hearing about how confusing and challenging it was for the adults around them, rather than having I'm the expert, let me tell you what it is. But to be like, hey, do you want to hear what I went through? Or, I mean, there are ways to reach people, but the main thing is to live it, that's how ritual is learned. It's not like being in Nigeria, for example, there's more cultural intactness in Yoruba areas, despite also a lot of colonialism. The ritual, it's not like, hey, I'm going to teach these kids about this ritual today. It doesn't happen like that. They just hang out and witness it over and over. They're like, here, hold this thing, do this, go get this chicken, or go, like help, because we're doing ritual now. It's normal. It's just what's happening. So the last thing I'd say is model talking directly to the ancestors. It's like, oh, you seem to be struggling. Can I ask the ancient grandmas and grandpas who support you to step forward and bless you? Be happy to. Happy to do it out loud. Can we do it right now? Great. So, yeah, that is what I would say about that. Thank you for the question.
So I think this question would be a good next step. It's from, I'll just read the question then. Is that good to go, Daniel? Okay. Can you speak more of the elements and essentials in being a practitioner at the borderlands in times of change, helping to let die what must die and let live what must live? So I'm gonna start with an ecological metaphor from permaculture that I was actually just introduced to. Um, and it talks about how the most fertile and creative space in your garden or your permaculture plot, the way you're tending it, is the border. And the idea is you want to not manicure it too much or plant a lot of the same things. You actually want the diversity, the biodiversity of life. And it's from the mixing and the merging that all of this new life is created. So the idea being that there's a lot of creative potential at the border. And something I found just in my own journey with this stuff is the colonial project is all about the making of the other and then determining what are the rules and regulations around being in relationship with that other. That's what racialization is, right? The logic of the creation of another. So we're socialized, we're primed to not step across that line. We're conditioned and socialized to stay in our container, to stay in our little network. So you could say that primary decolonial gesture is pushing oneself to touch that line, to touch that border. Perhaps getting resourced and getting some skills once you get to the border. Like, what do I do at the border? How do I tend what might emerge here when these two opposites meet? Um, Eroding some of the prejudices that inform our lens. We have so many. It happens while we're in the womb. Epigenetic markers getting turned on and turned off through the imagery that your mother is absorbing or the stuff that she's navigating on a daily basis. And then once you're out of the womb, that socialization or acculturation, racial acculturation continues. So I think it's essential. I think it's one of the primary things we need to learn because I call it the limitations of our identity. The politics of identity is the ways that we stay reduced into those spaces and we don't come into relationship with anything that is not the exact same, that is not homogenous. So um, the last thing I'll say about that is from my own practice, this idea of decolonizing the psyche. The example that Daniel just shared and offered, the radical vulnerability of looking at um, your own social handicaps, if you will, my own social limitation, and then a willingness to compost, a willingness to engage in a form of like psychic composting or grieving or some kind of ritual around that where I actively um, let the charge dissipate through crying. It could be through dancing. I went to Haitian dance class Sunday. That's an active discharge of the energy. It helps to reshape my nervous system, right? Which is where all of that meaning and story lives from that somatic perspective.
Thank you.
Hmm.
Um, I'm going to speak to just one more question. There are just three that have come in. And then why don't we, after that, spend a little bit of time in embodied practice before we wrap up? The question that comes is, I'm curious your thoughts on the rise of racialized violence in the US and how we can transform our ways of belonging to heal from these realities. And maybe I'll try to speak to it a little bit, and then Amber, of course, if there's anything you want to add. The first thing that occurs, and this is also coming out of animist ethics and values as well, is there definitely is not just one right way to do that. In besides the fact that how myself as a European ancestor person or somebody else who's a recent arrival as a refugee compared to someone who has deep African ancestral roots here compared to somebody who's Native American, people are going to have different ways that the history of trauma and the impact of the systems are landing with them, of course. And so in that way, the work of any given person will be different. The work that we're born into and that we're made to have to reckon with is different. But even within any given group, people have different souls and different medicines and different callings and different gifts. And it's very common for people who are passionate about their particular approach to be like, hey, I figured out the approach. Others need to do this. And if you don't have a strong center, it's easy to be like, oh, geez, I want to do the right thing. This person's compelling. I need to do what they're doing. But it might not actually be your way in to the cultural change work. So allow that there are lots of different ways. Another is not alone, because you'll just drown in it. If you actually get beyond the intellectual, or if you actually like try to change the systems long enough to get to burnout, then it's going to be hard on your body and your psyche if you're isolated. So it's really important to find at least a couple really loving, good people around you, and like cultivate your relationship with the land and the waters and the ancestors and the powers. Because if you try to go at changing collective, stubborn systems in an isolated way, it's not very sustainable. It's not very joyful.
Yeah.
Another, yeah.
Go
Let me
ahead.
just see if there's maybe anything else. The a last thing I guess I'd say, and there's so much, but to keep it succinct, keep entrained on the systems. There's a tendency to collapse change work. I've seen in the US at times, there can be a tendency to collapse it into just arriving at the very polished right view and keeping your view current and making sure your social media posts reflect that very current and accurate view and helping others to correct their view so they are up to speed with the most recent view or whatever. And that's not, uh, it's the systems primarily. Somebody's work who I found helpful, Ibrahim Kendi, writes about his own journey of coming with assumptions that racist views lead to racist policies and systems, and discovering from his research that the causative chain tends to be in the other direction, that a small number of people, usually for often financial benefit, create racist systems that then perpetuate and lead to the internalizing of racist ideologies and views and behaviors. And so it's not that it's one factor only, but keep focus on reforming and changing and interrupting the actual systems and structures and laws and policies that disadvantage people of different groups and that discriminate. if we could all wake up tomorrow super conscious and the systems are still there. And so I would say not lose track of that. That feels really it's easy to be discouraged at that kind of work, but that's where the lasting change, I think, in some ways, it comes from.
Um, yeah, that was, I agree. Let me just first start there, especially around the systems piece. I like to share this little anecdote. My mother never looked at me and said, "Oh, look at Amber, my little marginalized baby. Isn't she adorable?" She never said that to me because it's not the context of our relationship. And that's really important in light of what Daniel just shared, of focusing on these structures and these institutions that have created um, uh, race, or needed the components of race for them to be alive, to stay alive or come alive. Um, Racialization and racial capitalism was the answer to feudalism in Europe. It was the economic solution to the inescapable poverty, um, uh, the religious crusades that had ensued with the coupling of religion and empire. Um, and I think for me, what's most present is that was the economic solution, but we never grappled with the psychic resolution to what happened, right? And so the invention of race emerged from that. Um, I just to get purely political on it, I'm cautioned and concerned by the 2016 findings that um, foreign governments were meddling in our elections, and specifically utilizing the strategy of creating a race war to distort and disrupt the election process in 2016. And that is a powerful psychic pimple, if you will, to push on. It's one that we haven't really been tending as a collective. And I think for the most part, they were successful. We see that evidence in the news. So there's that piece. Um, from a personal perspective and approach, I know in my own works in the world, really modeling after what Daniel has put forth as a white racialized person contributing to healing this big collective cultural trauma, which is encouraging that others find themselves in this project and start to unpackage their own historical legacies and inheritances, and develop the spaciousness in their own nervous system to hold some of the gravity of what we're trying to fix or heal or metabolize. Um, I encourage white racialized folks who end up in spaces I'm facilitating to identify in their family line when their people, if they can, stopped referring to themselves as Polish or Irish or whatever European tribe, and started to refer to themselves as white. And you get a whole slew of answers. You get, why would I need to know that? What difference does it make in my life? And that's the first step. Getting to that space, going back to what was said earlier, the collective denial is a huge, major strategy of this racialization project, the denial. And it forces others to hold more of the gravity of this issue or phenomenon than everybody else. That's a part of how it is perpetuated. So we need the collective human body to share the hit of this charge, which means cultivating critical consciousness about your own story, about what happened to you.
Thank you, Amber. Yeah. Before we head into just a little bit of embodied practice, I want to underscore that we do have two courses starting this month with ancestral medicine. One is Foundations of Ritual, the other is Animist Psychology. And there are scholarship payment plan, cost reduction kinds of things available to keep the work accessible to anyone who wants to join. And we have small breakout groups for each of the live calls that happen, held with the BIPOC only option for those, and also a weekly BIPOC only call, an LGBTQ only call, an Australia friendly, Asia friendly time zone call. So we hold an ethic of inclusivity to support the learning that's international and culturally mindful, and have about 30 different ritualists resourcing the work. So trying to really make it work for online learning and the times. And this recording will be available. We'll follow up with folks who signed up. And if you know people who would benefit from the conversation, of course, feel welcome to share it with them. And is there anything, Amber, that you would want to direct folks toward in terms of your offerings in the world, or ways to be in touch or anything before we head into practice?
Yeah. So next week we have an online trauma conference or trauma healing conference called Tending the Roots. It's with a global digital village called Rooted and Embodied. Um, and one of the things that is really exciting about it is a reframing of the concept of trauma, sort of pulling it out of or delinking it from Eurocentric perspectives, looking at it as a sort of blocked life force, as opposed to the pathologizing ways that we've often looked at it in the psych field. Um, we are in centering the voices and wisdom of Indigenous spiritual teachers and healers. Um, in fact, Daniel will also be presenting there for an hour or so next week. So I invite you to join us. It's completely free. All you have to do is sign up.
Okay, great. And the link for that is in the chat. Let's take 10 minutes or so. And if you're willing to stay on with us to drop in together, we have 100 folks on the call, and it's nice to be in shared ritual. I know there are people in Europe and other places here, so I'll talk you through a thing. And thank you again, Amber, for your presence and time. Really appreciate the shared conversation. Everybody else for tuning in. So if you would start just by noticing your own body, your breath, your physical space, and do whatever helps you to orient to being very inhabited in your physical space and presence. And while that's happening, just notice your connection with at least one trusted power. It may be a wise and kind ancestor or other spiritual helper that you work with, or just your connection with love and wisdom in your own inner divinity. But notice the larger web of connection around you. And from that place, take a moment and intend with you and other supportive presences that your personal space be clear and free from any interference or negativity that doesn't need to be in your space at this time. So take a moment just to clear your space in whatever way is right for you. And while that's happening, invite a layer of protection and containment around your personal space at a distance that is comfortable so that you're embodied, resourced, clear, and protected. And from this place, we'll take a moment and just notice the mystery of the ancestors. And maybe you already have a long term relationship with them, or maybe you're new to relating with your people. But what I would invite here in this context is to ask that those among your people, you don't need to know their names or the details, but those among your people who are wise and kind and healed and vibrant in their condition, as a collective, draw just a bit closer to the edge of your space and circle. And those who are still in need, or maybe in a state of turbulence or discontent for whatever reason, that they're able to take just one step back and to be held by those elders who are able to hold those ones. But you're asking in this moment that the benevolent resourcing ones among your people draw close to you. And in that moment, there may be a moment of encounter, or it may just be sharing space. Notice your nervous system, your capacity, your vessel, your psyche, just on its own. And then notice when you're in some kind of contact and communion with your people, notice how your capacity is more, and how when you're with them, maybe you picture like joining hands with them or whatever it might be, honor where your boundaries are at there. But notice that when you're near with them and close with them, your capacity is increased in some way, that you're stronger together with them. From that place of just resting in presence with your people, if it is where you want to turn your attention, notice the earth beneath you both and the land where you're specifically at, and the ancient, radiant, beautiful sentience and soul of the earth, and that this elder power, who we also are, on a really practical level, when we're bringing that conscious, helps us to have more resilience, to notice in this moment that when it's you and the earth receiving a blow or confronting a thing, that you're stronger because of it. Notice that also with your people. Maybe it's enough just to rest in that, resting in your space. You felt connection with your supportive ancestors and the earth beneath you. And if you wish, I'll weave in just one other layer, which is to notice the bigger context that we're all moving at many thousands of miles per hour through space and just past the new moon, and you're noticing the sun, the moon, the stars, and the bigger cosmos that is also reflected in your soul and your very specific life. The vastness of the universe is also present inside what you are. And from just that shift of attention, notice that when it's you and your people and the earth and the stars meeting a moment, it's a different kind of moment. And that remembering your place in the bigger context supports resilience. Let's take just another minute or two, and the invitation here is to just rest, like to just be carried in a boat down the river, to just let yourself be held by your people, by the earth, by the bigger gravity and forces that hold us. And to, for the next 2 minutes, just to be in presence with one another without needing to say or do anything. We give thanks to the ancestors. We give thanks to the old powers that hold up life. We give thanks to the spirits of fire and metal and petroleum that allow for these kinds of communications to happen in this way. We give thanks for the life of Amber McZeal and her people. And I pray that folks go with whatever is good for their lives and let all else just be. And with that, if it helps you to just rest in this place, it's great. And know that the support of your people and the earth and the bigger systems are always, always, always available to you. And yeah, I hope in some form you stay in touch, and perhaps I'll see you next week at the Rooted conference as well. Thank you again, Amber, and we'll wrap up like that. Take care, everybody.